Thank
Hello.
you so
Hi.
much for being with us today. It's so lovely to have this opportunity to virtually gather together with fellow artists, academics, and audience members who are involved and invested in the production of transnational East Asian culture. My name is Raylan, and I am co-director of Tangram alongside Alex Ho. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to New Creativities in the UK's East Asian music scene, which is a performance symposium co-hosted by Tangram and SOAS University of London. This event is inspired by our experience as artists witnessing a burgeoning movement of transnational East Asian artists here in the UK, and inspired by our experience of how fruitful it can be when we are able to make connections with other people involved in this space. So Tangram is an artist collective of transnational Chinese artists who are hoping to transcend the East-West divide through performance, research, and activism. And as a collective, we all came together as a result of one initial collaboration and conversation between myself and Alex Ho. We met in 2017 and had a conversation about our experiences navigating Chinese and Western cultures as music creators, me from the angle of performing the Yangqin from a young age as a Chinese American in the US, and Alex as a British Chinese composer with parents from Hong Kong who grew up in London and was classically trained. We were able to connect through a shared question, and that enabled us to create art with a shared purpose. And that one connection led to 9 and is continuing to grow. And we're hoping that that kind of catalytic connection is something we can encourage today amidst this group, spark some of those conversations, because we believe that that can have a beautiful multiplier effect and allow us to make sense of this increasingly complex and exciting set of questions that comes up around navigating the different meanings of identity, heritage, cultural translation in the era of globalization and digitalization. So these are some of the questions we're going to be diving into today. I would say the overarching summary of that would be, what does it mean to create East Asian identity in the West today? And we're very, very happy and grateful to be joined by some amazing artists and producers today. We have shakuhachi player and ethnomusicologist Kiku Day. We have Tangram player and academic Hyelim Kim. We have the CEO and artistic director of Chinese Arts Now, An-Ting Chang. And we have writer, director, and activist David Say here with us today. So the way this is going to work is we'll begin with a conversation between Hyelim and Kiku. We'll continue to conversation with An-Ting, and finally we'll have a conversation with David. These will be moderated by myself and Alex, and in between each discussion we'll have an open Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question at any point, we will just ask you to make a note in the chat that you would like to ask a question, or if you would prefer not to, because once you do, we will then call on you and have you speak your question. If you'd rather us read it for you, you can type out the question in the chat. And if you're not comfortable with the chat, you can also raise your hand when it comes to the Q&A portion. And then at the very end, we have a very special premiere, and we'll introduce that towards the end. I also want to say a big thank you to SOAS University of London for co-hosting this symposium with us and sponsoring it. SOAS has always been an incredible hub for conversations, knowledge exchange, and art creation around multicultural identity. And we're opening today with a conversation between 3 SOAS alumni, me, Kiku, and Hyelim. So I do want to express gratitude to SOAS for creating this kind of space for us. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to ask Kiku and Hyelim to please unmute yourselves. And I am going to give you a brief introduction to anyone who was not at our concert yesterday. So anyone who, some of you may have been there with us yesterday. We had part 1 of this performance symposium in the form of a YouTube premiere concert that is still up and you can watch. And we had some amazing performances from both Kiku and Hyelim on shakuhachi and Tangram, respectively. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction. So Kiku Day is a shakuhachi player and ethnomusicologist and a world traveler from Copenhagen, Denmark, who is working at the intersections of performance of traditional shakuhachi music, contemporary music and improvisation, ethnomusicology, history, politics, meditation, and writing. Hyelim Kim is a performer, composer, and researcher whose aim is to open new possibilities for Korean music and to promote exchange with a wide variety of musical cultures. She was identified as a pioneering artist by the Korean Arts Council and has been afforded many other opportunities and prizes, both in Korea and in the UK. Hi, Hyelim. Hi, Kiku. How are you doing?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I'd love to start out by just asking how you felt about yesterday's virtual performance.
I mean, it was great. It was a great mix. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I also enjoy very much. And I was fascinated to see that even though the genres and the styles are quite wide variety, but there are always some kind of a common ground. We are always coming back and share. So I just find this really exciting.
Absolutely. It was so great to see the different resonances between the different performances, even though they were all coming from very different traditions. And one of those resonances for me was experiencing both of your improvisations within your sets. Stunningly beautiful. And also I felt shared a sort of parallel in that they were drawing from your rich experience as people working in these music traditions. So drawing from history, but then also inflecting, your own voice and your own contemporary sensibilities in one moment, in one performance. So the first question I would love to just kind of prompt conversation between both of you with is, what is the role of improvisation in your work?
Go first, Kiku.
Okay.
Go first, Kiku.
Well, I'm trained in classical Western music, and then I was afterward trained as a shakuhachi player with a master-pupil kind of relationship, and I stayed with this master for 11 years, just doing that. And so in none of those traditions, improvisation as such is a part of it. In shakuhachi, it's not. however, my teacher was quite open-minded, and he often called it improvisation, although that I would probably, as an ethnomusicologist, say that it's more interpretation. You've got freedom to do some things, but as a classical musician, I really couldn't. I didn't know how to improvise. You know, it was kind of a blank for me. So the shakuhachi was kind of a step in between. You know, this flexibility was quite an interesting part, and from there I could really use it as a springboard into improvisation. And for me, improvisation is really interesting. Partly because of the way you have to listen as an improviser, and have to like both, you know, dare to go in and do whatever you want, but you also have to give space, and I really like that social aspect of it. And in my own compositions, there's always improvisation. In in fact, most of my compositions are structured improvisation. I write down what kind of structure the piece should have, and then I improvise within that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Hyelim?
Yeah. My situation was somewhat similar, a little bit different, because I trained as a Korean traditional music from a young age. And when I came to London, I happened to be collaborating people who are not actually from Korean music background. So whenever I have a transnational or transcultural communication, I found that the dominant application for the communication is normally led by mainstream music. More specifically, what the collaborators expect, to use some kind of a keys or tuning systems of equal temperament, metric systems for the stop notation, etc. However, many musical systems may not necessarily operate on these standards. But as for improvisation, even though each individual has their own governing system that their musical practice are based on, but a main device for music, as Kiku mentioned, is adjusted by listening. So by doing so, the music creation is empowered equally by all the players. So
if we don't happen to get into a situation where let's get a groove going, okay, and then we build on top of that, and then you're already in a box kind of thing.
Yeah.
As artists who've both worked in the UK, where so often this is how one finds work, is through collaborations with people from different genres and different cultures. Could you speak a little bit more about what discoveries you've made through these cross-cultural collaborations? Maybe what things have worked and what things have been where there's been more friction.
Do you want to go ahead now, Hyelim?
I'm thinking now.
Okay, I can start. I mean, there's all kinds of collaborations. If you collaborate with composers, what I really, really like is also that they kind of also break your habits. You know, so that's the same way improvisation. You don't know what's going to come. So very often they also break your, you know, you've got these motorways in your brain of, for me, how to play shakuhachi. You do like this kind of thing. And composers break those because they hear differently and they don't always know how it is to be a shakuhachi player. So sometimes they come up with things that doesn't work, but they can also come up with things where I'm like, why didn't I think about that? And with improvisers, it's the same. Because of the listening, you break habits, and I think there are some great discoveries to do together in that moment.
I found improvisations as a particularly more useful when I work with like cross disciplines, because recently to me it's really fascinating to work with people from different disciplines beyond the musical area, musical realms. More recently, I've been interested in working with the creators in the world of dance and fine arts and some kind of a film. So like for this kind of dance medium, I have focused on specifically on those kind of movements that are not conventionally perceived as dance, but instead on bodily movements and gestures that are triggered through performance of feelings and kind of thoughts. So these movements may not fit into that kind of usual expectations of a stylized or aesthetically programmed music or dance kind of a per se. So improvisation is very useful to interact with these kind of people who are not from musical background, and that we can just freely explore the kind of area which is beyond some kind of stylized languages.
Can I just I think Rachel asked a question about, yeah, she wrote, I'd love to hear about some specific examples, right?
Yes, thank you, Kiku. We'll ask questions in at 3:25. We'll open it up to questions. Okay. But I think, Hyelim, thank you. That I think really came across in your artist biography yesterday, the way you're pushing the boundaries of Tangram music and bringing it beyond just sound, bringing it into gesture. And which brings me to a kind of personal question. As someone who has been performing Yangqin in the UK, bringing traditional Chinese music here, but also trying to navigate these new spaces, these Western musical spaces, and working across disciplines, across cultures. Sometimes I feel uprooted, and I feel I feel that it's difficult for me to stay grounded in the heritage while also pushing boundaries and finding new soundscapes. So I'm curious if you can speak to, maybe Hyelim first, how you're able to maintain balance, how you're able to stay sort of grounded in that connection to tradition while also innovating and continuing to make new strides in your practice.
Yeah, I totally understand how you feel when it comes to this kind of a transcultural context where you're normally positioned in this cosmopolitan environment. And it's very tricky to anchor your identity within this kind of very diverse elements are all mingled. Mm-hmm. So I think to me, first of all, I think you need to, I try to clarify my cultural identity first and anchored onto it as a ground. And then when it comes to collaboration, I try to find some kind of a mutual ground or languages equally shared by both sides, instead of us try to superimpose or impose what I already got or what I already learned into the others, or the other way around. So for example, I try to use some kind of elements, like bodily languages is one of them, because a human being always creating this kind of bodily gestures out of a habit or everyday life. So instead of a stylized language that, as I mentioned just before, or some kind of a natural aspects of the world, like natural element. Nature can be equally shared by everyone. It doesn't kind of imply any kind of a cultural specific ideas onto any sides. So these kind of more mutual languages can be used on more creative tool to create more balanced collaboration to everyone.
Thank you. I love that, grounding it in mutual languages, finding that common ground which can be found in unexpected places too. Kiku, your thoughts on that balance between the tradition and the innovation?
Yes. I mean, really pragmatically, it really depends on the work. If I'm hired by somebody, I sometimes just have to go in and do what they expect of me. And that's times where I sometimes also feel get thrown out of balance. You know, I mean, there are people that give me quite. I mean, the shakuhachi. I have also entered the Western classical repertoire in a way. You know, the better and the more virtuosic you can play, fully tuned as Western instrument, you know, the better. There's one style of shakuhachi going that way, and certainly led by Japanese, conservatory educated players, as well as some non-Japanese. So for me, it's really depends if we are in a collaboration where we equal. We can start from the ground a little bit like Hyelim said. We can find common grounds, and it is true that it's actually very good to have some kind of an abstract idea. So Haley mentioned nature. It can be light and darkness. It can be so many things where you try to explore from both sides, and still keeping your feet on the ground.
Thank you. I also want to highlight, Hyelim, I think this very important thing you said about defining your cultural identity as an anchoring point as you venture into these different spaces. And I also want to acknowledge that both of you are not only artists who perform and create your own music, but you're also researchers. So Kiku is an ethnomusicologist, and you have a PhD in ethnomusicology from SOAS. And Hyelim, you are visiting research fellow at Bath Spa University. Is that right? Yeah. So I'd love to hear what this process of defining your cultural identity looks like or feels like through research and creating and music creation. If you can speak to that process. Kiku.
Maybe Hyelim should maybe go first.
Sure.
I can then talk 2 hours.
Okay.
I see. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's beneficial for both sides. I can look at it objectively and subjectively, and from an empirical and an analytical approaches. So, like, my music practice benefits from my academic research for sure. As a musician, we're always dealing with such intangible knowledge. But a sound academic background enables me to communicate these abstract and personal languages much more effectively with others. So in other words, it helps me share my musical intention and interpretations to a wider scope, and even to practitioners in other disciplines. On the other hand, my academic pursuits and topics are very much informed by my experience as a practitioner performer. So my research topics and methodologies can be very much enriched by my empirical and personal experience, I think. So this interplay between the theoretical academic and the practical ultimately enriches my experience and creativity in both sides, I think.
Thank you. Kiku, yeah. and then we'll open up to questions. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree very much with what Hyelim said. You know, as a researcher, I also have an emic view somehow to the sounds, the instrument, the physicality, and these kind of things. And also, sometimes the research also informs me. For example, if I research regional shakuhachi styles, it informs me in my playing. in another way that I wouldn't have been able to if I had not been a researcher. But you also asked about the cultural identity, and I really have. I mean, correct me if that's not correct, but I mean, when people talk about your cultural identity, then there is kind of a common understanding of this East Asian cultural identity. And as somebody who's half Japanese, half American, grew up in Denmark, um, my cultural identity is really Danish. And I have had a lot of battle. And of course, the research informs me here as well. I get to know more about Japan, which is the place of my, the country of the origin of my instrument. Um, but it's something that has really been problematic for me because I have to represent something that I'm not fully comfortable with because I don't know how it is to be a Japanese person as such. I don't know how it is to go to school. I don't know these kind of things. So and be an equal in a Japanese society. So therefore, it's something that's really caused me a lot of problem. What the shakuhachi playing has maybe helped me, and you have to understand if you, for example, grow up in the UK or the USA, you do have communities of East Asian people, and I basically never met an East Asian when I grew up in very homogeneous Denmark, white Denmark. So there was only white people around me, and I couldn't understand why people couldn't see me as see that I was Danish. So playing the shakuhachi and also doing research actually have, for the identity thing, it's actually really helped me to realize and not to ignore that genetic part. And of course, as a shakuhachi player, done this teacher pupil relationship, I got really soaked into that culture. So it's not a national culture, but in the culture of shakuhachi in some ways. And of course, it's related. I learned so much about Japan through shakuhachi. So I think the shakuhachi helped me personally with my identity. Otherwise, I probably would never stop resisting.
Thank you. And I think hearing your responses is highlighting for me how, obviously how complex this question is, but also thinking about it, it hinges on who is perceiving the answer to the question. So thinking about what my cultural identity is to myself has very different implications and is a different process than telling someone else, like telling a presenter, for example, how to market my performance and talk about my cultural identity, or how to communicate to a collaborator. And so it's not just about like a definition, but I think also it really is just that conversation or that communication, and what comes after that. So speaking of communication, I'd love to open it up to a couple of questions now. I'm just going to open up to gallery view. We have some questions in the chat, so thank you. We will get to those. But I want to just see if there's anyone who wants to speak a question, and you can raise your hand if you want. Otherwise, I will read out the questions in the chat. Okay. Nothing burning live at the moment, so I will go to our first question. Oh, yes, David, please.
I think it's fascinating to hear the kind of intersectionality of so many experiences and the kind of cultural mishmash of being both East Asian as well as in the West, and finding, I suppose, finding sources of inspiration and drawing from your East Asian heritage is a very similar process that many of us have been through. So, whether we're working in music or theatre or whatever art form, I think a lot of us have explored those questions. And I guess for me, in the end, it doesn't really matter. What matters is I mean, it matters to yourself personally at a certain stage, but I think in the end, what matters is the spirit of how something is done, perhaps, or the beauty of it, or the universality of it. And I think that's one thing that's very wonderful about both your pieces that I saw you both play, is that it crosses cultural, it crosses all those boxes that people want to put others into, kind of easy definitions. And there's something that art does which creates a kind of common ground that everybody can experience, enjoy, and it's kind of beyond issues about cultural identity. I think sometimes great art. That's what I feel. So it's less of a question. It's more a comment.
Okay.
I suppose in terms of reflecting back on what you've both just said. But my question to you, I do have a question. Is you know, what's the way forward for you? Because, you know, of this thing of trying to engage with the West that wants to sort of, in some ways, put you in a box and say, oh, you are an East Asian performer playing East Asian music. How do you want to kind of break out of that box, I suppose, and just be an artist?
I mean, you just pointed out that the most important, what matters is the universality of the great art. I agree with you, but also on the other hand, I also find it very challenging that people who doesn't understand a very culture specific background and ideas underlining the Korean traditional practices. So I found it really challenging. And when it comes to the live performance and the practices, I found that there are some kind of a limitation to explain all the kind of a specific culture specific ideas for the practices, certain practices. So you were asking me about what is the way forward. So what I'm doing currently is try to integrate visual media to show that kind of an original context or some kind of a historical / social cultural context where the traditional music originally located and placed. So because in the concert hall, I try to like justify that music just through the sound. I find it's really challenging because people who doesn't know so well about the traditional Korean music beforehand. So that kind of using kind of a visual media is I found it very efficient because these days the visual images are very prominent everywhere, the literacy of the visual images. So I just trying to employing that kind of a medium to convey those culture specific knowledges for further understanding on East Asian music.
I would say I completely agree with you, David, that you know, it's the creation of music that really matters, the creation of art that matters, and it's really interesting because I mean, when I go to Japan, I'm just a foreigner, obviously, and so it is a balance for me how to deal with that, and I actually try to be non-culture specific in my sound. So in some ways, I've always tried to find new sounds to express that really the complexity of myself. You know, I had some questions. We had some questions sent over. In one sentence, how would you describe your artistic practice? And I just said a soul search. And trying to find that soul of myself in there. There's something about the culture specificness that makes me feel uneasy because I always become a representation of something that I'm not. So I actually prefer really to work trying to almost like be a vacuum, and that's of course not possible at all. But somehow I try to be non-specific.
And just one quick follow-up
Actually,
question.
sorry, David, I think we need to move on to,
All right,
because we only have 4 minutes left for this Q&A,
okay.
but thank you so much. We have a couple of seconded questions about if either of you could just describe a collaboration, a specific example of a collaboration where you've had to navigate some of these tensions. Perhaps one that worked well.
I can say like in some collaborations where you find new. That's mostly because if I work with composers, they completely hear the shakuhachi in a different way, and they, you know, like shakuhachi has this noise that's part of the mouthpiece that you have, and then there's like, can you isolate these noises? And as a shakuhachi player, when you're a beginner, you have a lot of noise, and you try to get rid of that noise. You try to play as pure as possible. So in a way, and to be so interested in the noises surprised me, although it's kind of banal, but the way it was done and the way he wanted me to try to change the pitch background, even though I'm just playing noises, and so that kind of collaboration could be great.
Yeah. And Hyelim, is there a specific example that comes to mind to animate some of these things you've been talking about?
There are so many. It's very hard to choose one, but I just want to briefly introduce my most recent collaboration. It's about kind of a cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary project. Work with choreographer, cinematographer, and photographer, and me. So I found that it's a very interesting because there's no certain kind of a director whatsoever. So because we just are using different kind of artistic medium to convey the certain common theme. So we share the kind of, we talked a lot. So I think mainly when we embark on launch some kind of a project, we always are thinking about very practical things, and that we don't have enough time to share our culture or our medium or kind of a specialty. So this kind of a long period of a conversation and understanding the person instead of their kind of a technique or skills is really like very unusual, even though it's very important things. We normally quite neglect that kind of aspect. So understanding the person instead of the art, I found it's really, really interesting because, yeah, we often forgot about it.
Yes. Thank you so much for those responses. So much food for thought, and we have many great questions in the chat, but we do have to move on to our second panel with Alex and An-Ting. So what I would like to do is to encourage us to keep this conversation going on social media. If you want to ask these questions, and we can connect you with our artists to keep this conversation going, all I'll ask you to do if you use Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook is to use this hashtag I'm putting in the chat now, which is hashtag new creativities, plural, which is the hashtag we're going to use for this symposium, for this network, for us to stay connected and keep this conversation going beyond today. And if you can tag at Tangram Sound as well, that'll make sure that we see it and we can connect you with the person you're asking the question to. So as we explore this overarching question of how we create and translate East Asian identity in the West, I want to highlight that we're kind of thinking about this in two planes. One is this plane of the artist and the creator, the internal creative process of navigating cultural identity, coming up with that definition, creating art to express it. The other plane is on how we curate and how we translate this identity to UK audiences. And that's a place where producers and curators play a big role. And one of these very pioneering producers here in London is An-Ting Chang, who is artistic director and CEO of Chinese Arts Now. So I'd love to pass this off now to Alex and An-Ting.
Thank you very much, Raylan, and such invigorating conversation with Kiku and Hyelim. And I'm really glad that our kind of chat box is so lively. And I imagine that the questions that we didn't quite get to just then we'll cover at least to some extent in probably these next two conversations. But welcome, An-Ting. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for
Cool.
inviting. It's very fun, like a symposium, and with a great performance yesterday.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's an absolute pleasure to have you, and a bit of kind of historical context, which is not very old, about the kind of relationship between Chinese Arts Now and Tangram is that it was in Chinese Arts Now's festival in 2019, sorry, which is where Tangram was launched. And so kind of Chinese Arts Now is a really kind of exciting platform, and they have a rather large and wonderful festival each year. It provides so many opportunities for artists across loads of different disciplines, not just music, to showcase what they do, and within that, I guess, the plurality of what it can mean to at least create kind of Chinese identity today. But An-Ting, I think just to start off, I understand that there's a video that you wanted to share with everyone. I think Raylan is going to do that via his share screen. So if it's okay, maybe we'll start with that and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Great. Okay.
Lovely. I mean, where better to start than that. I mean, An-Ting, do you want to say a little bit about what Chinese Arts Now do and your plans for 2021?
Great. Thank you. So thank you for like sharing like the video, because I always think it's for art. It's always like the work speak better than talk. So like I think it's always like good to see some evidence of like the work to start with. And as I'm talking about the curatorial kind of like work today, it's better to start with like what it is like. And I think as you can see, it's kind of like a diverse range of contemporary art forms talking about contemporary Chinese stories. And I would like to share just like two main thoughts when it's come to just like a curation and also the remit of the organization I set up since I started being artist director like 2 years ago. So first thing is like when we are talking about we want to share contemporary Chinese culture, I think very often people forget about when we're talking about Chinese culture, we are talking about billions of people in the world. It's not we are talking about just like one small area or one kind of like not even a country. We are not talking about a country. We are not even talking about 5 countries. We are talking about billions of Chinese people like living in every different part in the world and having some kind of like Chinese heritage. But unfortunately, I think most cases and people just misunderstand Chinese culture as a certain kind of way how people are like. But this is, as I mentioned about this is billions of people and people live in hundreds of countries in the world. And I think we feel probably those people would be a little bit different between each other instead of like there's just a one type of people one type of culture we are talking about. So that comes out of this festival idea, where I just feel it is actually really unfair if we say, okay, Chinese Arts Now, we just produce one production and this present contemporary Chinese culture. It's definitely wrong. So the idea of the festival is like kind of like we share like contemporary perspectives from different culture. Like for example, like Tangram was like in our festival like 2019, and it was great to have them. And they are formed by an artist collective, and then some people grow up here, some people grow up in the US, and then you use like contemporary. I think Alex, you were trained like for a classical music, right? Like originally, and then just and then Raylon is great Yang player. So this kind of like a collision in between like the people working together create a kind of a contemporary Chinese culture in a fascinating way, and in a way people don't really expect, just like to go to China and see something. And also you can see we also have dance, we have digital arts, and then we have like performance arts, we have a lineup of like queering artists. And what I want people come to festival and afterwards what people get from this Chinese contemporary Chinese culture is that, wow, everybody is so different. It's like they got some unique story to tell, which we don't normally hear from the main stage of the art, kind of like artworks. We don't normally hear about British Chinese story. We don't usually hear about contemporary Chinese music. And so, but that's what you get from the festival and how different everybody is. And there's no one type of Chinese culture. That's what's a very important curatorial like principle here. And I think, so I am, in addition to being an artist director, I'm also a musician, composer. And so the music you're hearing was also like something we devised together with some musicians, like for some contemporary Chinese music. And what I found problematic, this is another thought I want to share you, is like I found whenever talking about traditional Chinese instruments, I found it's really problematic. Like the way just like I found it's problematic because like they are instruments. I mean, piano is old as well, but we never say piano like a traditional piano, like we say piano, like it's also hundreds years old. It's kind of like since the birth of like piano. And then there are some Chinese instruments which is older, some Chinese instruments are younger, but they are Chinese instruments. And they got very unique language. When I say unique language, it's in contrast to Western like instrument, just like a piano would never sound in the similar way to like to Ka-Shing or to the different like Chinese instrument. So like I see those Chinese instruments as different musical languages, but not the traditional one or contemporary one. They are different musical languages. And I was trained also, like Alex, I was trained as a contemporary, Western trained pianist. And for me, those instruments just enrich our like a musical world. and the audio receptions, I think that's just so much richer. And then we got a lot of different variety of musical languages from those instruments. And I think this is a good for marketing purpose whenever we talk about traditional, or we talk about ethnic, or we talk about world music. But we need to understand this is also a colonizing idea where it's Western music centered, like where we are talking about those. And what, after all, they are music languages, just like British Chinese stories. They are a part of like stories like happening in this country, forming British history, a part of British history, instead of this is ethnically very different or anything. It's a part of the country. So that's kind of like I want to share you with these two thoughts, like which set up in a way the principle of the way I curate the festival.
Thank you so much, An-Ting, for that. Almost felt like a manifesto. I kind of want to get up and give you a virtual hug, because I totally agree with all of that. And I think that I have so much admiration for the way in which not just the enthusiasm with which you speak, but also the clear sense that what you're doing, there is a social impetus, and you're hoping clearly, and I think you're doing so really well, to change perceptions about what being Chinese means in Britain today. And I think as a someone who comes from kind of the Western classical music sphere, as soon as you see the word Chinese in a program or something, people will just have a very immediate, almost kind of visceral reaction about what that sound will be. They will hear a gong, they will hear a pentatonic scale, and that's just in music. But these kind of very problematic and kind of monolithic stereotypes are true across the arts and across like perceptions of what China is. And so that sense of plurality, I think, is something which Chinese arts now do pretty sensationally. And I'm also really glad that you bring up the point about yourself being a creator as well as curator, and maybe that's something that we can kind of unpack a little bit more now. And I think something which will become very clear by the end of this this series of conversations today is that all of the artists here are kind of doing so many different things. They're not just writing music, they're not just playing piano, they're not just playing Yangqin, but they're actively trying to shape conversations and direct and produce and curate. And these kind of multifaceted networks, I think, is a theme which probably connects most of the people in this room to some extent. And so, An-Ting, just to direct a question to you then, like what were the kind of things that made you decide to be the director of Chinese arts now? And obviously, you have a PhD in piano performance and wrote a kind of music. And so how did the desire to be a director intersect with your interests as a creator?
Yeah, I think like there are a few points about this. So first part is like I am always enthusiastic about cross art form performances. I'm trained as a musician, but actually when I was in university, I did theater directing alongside my chemistry degree. So that's so I'm really kind of like trained as theater director in a way. So like and with my PhD, I wrote music. My main research is about creating a new style of performance art, like by combining theater with music. So like that's kind of theater is always my passion alongside music. But being a producer, like as a producer for contemporary Chinese culture, so that's kind of like my other kind of like passion, which is I found myself, I love making art as well as making arts happen. So like I love like making the art project by like which my thoughts like starting with me, but I also love to be able to enable other art when I feel enthusiastic about I want to make those things happen. And I found I have this like this eager as well as just so like that's where it's differentiated me from being a producer and from being artist, like and I don't know, but and in a way kind of like I found this very there are lots of like even like successful like artists kind of like doing their own work. It's always like I think if you truly love art, you really would love to make other art happen as well, because you definitely don't just love the art you make, but also love art, some art like other people make. It's just I think Tangram is also in a way kind of like a producer as well as like an artist, because you also curate concert, which is like presented by other artists. So I think in some way, like we all just like, especially when it comes to this kind of like a Chinese arts or East Asian arts, just we know if we don't try to just encourage each other to do things, and then probably there won't be this kind of thing. So we kind of like working together and just like keeping a composition, I think so really important. And that's where my dual role as artist director as well as artist from.
Definitely. I recall there being, I remember maybe a year ago now, Raylan and I met with An-Ting and some of the wondrous Chinese Arts Now team, and I can't even remember what the conversations were about, but I just remember when we left the room, Raylan and I were kind of so energized from the meeting. And I think it was purely just from the feeling of, and maybe this speaks a little bit to the conversation that was being said earlier about kind of soul searching, but finding other creators and curators who have kind of similar yet different experiences, wanting to do the same thing, and just that kind of collective power, I think, is something that Chinese Arts Now are kind of trailblazing in that sense today. And I guess something I'm aware of time now, but something which I'd love to ask you a little bit more about, An-Ting. It's just some of the recent works that Chinese Arts Now have commissioned. And I guess two that come to mind immediately are Casting Fu Manchu, which is a film available to watch on Chinese Arts Now's website right now. And it's an incredible kind of critique of the way in which East Asian actors and East Asian identities have been represented historically on screen. And then the second piece that comes to mind is 19 Ways of Looking, which is an absolutely awesome kind of Instagram opera created by Jasmine Kent Rodgman, and that's kind of I guess both 19 Ways of Looking and Casting Fu Manchu, you could say, are kind of direct responses to some of the racism that Southeast Asian and East Asian communities have faced in light of COVID. And so, An-Ting, I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you think pieces like these are important, and what excited you about working with the various artists from these two projects.
Yeah, I think these two works are really like brilliantly made. It's just like, please just go to Chinese Arts Now website and to have a look of that. You can look at them for free. So it's like it's a very direct response in terms of like COVID-19 from an East Asian, British East Asian perspective. And so like, and also both works involve a collective of like different artists in this country. I think Raylon is in 19 Ways of Looking. So like, so it's kind of like collect different people like working and making and use a sense of like a community of artists that create the work together, and where like Jasmine and Hyelim were like both artists, like leading artists for these two works, make a really, really great job on that. And just in terms of like selecting about these two works, it's like at the beginning of the outbreak of COVID-19, and we just found this is a particularly difficult time for artists, like which is like the theaters are just going to close, and then concerts are going to close, and how are we going to just like how are artists going to carry on making work? So we decide to call for digital commissions, and so like and then what we kind of like we want is a very just timely, just like a direct response in terms of like a response to time, because as I say, contemporary is like very much about what we focus on, and our contemporary is just not a very high concept about contemporary. Our contemporary is really now. What are you thinking now? What is the problem now? So, and we don't know, there's like lots of like the increasing racism, like kind of like it's just not very safe for East Asian people. Yeah, so like and so these two both like works like tackle a very important question here about this country, just topic which are just discussed too little. And also I think 19 Ways of Looking is a very artistic, like really, really high achieved work, and as an innovative like a Instagram opera, so like using dance and also the different story and the video filming, just like really use racism as a basic, responding to the racism as a basic, but create something really new. Yeah, so please go for a look of that. And yeah, I would like to mention like our Camp Festival 2021 is going to go ahead with like no matter how bad the situation is, like no matter COVID, we are not going to be just like overcome by like the COVID situation. So we will try to make as many events happen as possible. We just announce it, so you can see that we just have like a very rough program. But we would also like to include all the artists that we work together before to be involved in this festival. So hopefully, like Tangram, we will also do something together like for the festival. And Alex, yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. That's it's so inspiring to hear you and Ting speak in this way. I can see that the time now is 4 o'clock. So if anyone does have any questions, maybe I'll just suggest that for now we'll use the just use the chat function. So if you do have a question, do just put it in there, and An-Ting can respond. But I guess whilst we're waiting for any questions to be typed in and entered, An-Ting, I mean, I guess firstly, like, how do you just balance being a curator, director, and a creator, pianist, composer? Sometimes, like, how do you balance that on a kind of day-to-day basis?
I mean, very, very difficult. It's just really, really difficult. Yeah, no, but I mean, really luckily being a classical trained pianist, I have really high discipline in terms of like training myself. So like I do just work a lot, like in terms of like, because I mean, you know, being a pianist, you need to just really, if you want to carry on with and as well as composer, just if you want to carry on with a kind of like skill set you have, and you have to improve yourself as an artist. And I feel, I mean, in a way, it's a really, really positive thing. I feel I'm always challenged by great artists I'm working with. So I mean, that's a really big challenge when I see, oh, Alex is great and Rilo is great, but it's also, oh, how can I also create something great? So I think it's just really positive. And I think it's also the other thing very important. Like I want to mention is just like I think we all just like in a way we might not always like work together, or it might not be, but we will find right time to work together. But even if like people are not working together, but in a way kind of like we can also challenge to each other, and then also we can create something unique and good. I've seen that's a really, really positive thing. But then that would just bring the sector to be more seen, and so kind of like, and there will be more works and more high quality thing if we all feel like this kind of like positive competition between each other. Yeah.
For sure, and I think that's a kind of a perfect segue into our first question that we have from Becca Farnham, which is, of course, COVID has had so many awful impacts on the arts and artists, but I would love to hear some of the happy outcomes that have resulted from new virtual platforms and the like.
Yeah, I think it's definitely kind of, there are some just really good kind of like outcome. Just every bad thing, there will be some like good outcome as well still. And then I think what's just like digital platform brings is like it's amazing link of like people who, for example, just before we might always work for London audiences, but now there are people who are from different regions or different countries can also join. I think that's like a really exciting. And also, I think through this difficult time for everybody, and just I think the conversation, actually people feel more eager to have conversation to each other, and then also more like a partnership happening in a way. So we kind of like make a partnership to more organization in a way kind of we didn't have before. And as I say, kind of like we want to, because we feel this is such a difficult time, so we want to just get all of our artists back, and then to see Camp Festival as a collection point where artists can gather. And so this thought is like we normally didn't have, and we normally just think, oh, who are we going to present this festival? But kind of like this time we feel the importance of actually just let's gather together, let's Camp Festival to be a celebration point for all of artists we work together. So I think there are lots of like different things come out of this difficult time as well. So yeah, so I hope I'm a little bit positive instead of just all very negative. Yeah.
Definitely, and I guess one of the incredible opportunities that this new digital realm offers is, as you say, An-Ting, this sense of like transnational communication, and it seems like hugely apt that the artists of Chinese arts now are kind of transnational Chinese artists, and so that their work is being communicated across national boundaries. And I know just on this call, for instance, we have callers from lots of different countries and all around the world, and so there's something I think there's something amazing about this opportunity that we have online. We have another question from Rachel Harris, An-Ting, which is, what is the main audience for your productions? I guess you've kind of partly answered it already, but have you got more to say to that question?
Yeah, so like I'd say just, I mean, we have like some data to share, like, so just like we have like 40% of like white British and 40% of British East Asian. So which is in a way kind of like a quite ideal. I'm talking about ethnicity wise, like, but this is quite ideal way because we want to bring more, we want to share arts to definitely to more like British East Asian, like a broader like a public, and we want to like bring them to the theaters, the concert halls, and to, because this is subject matter. Sometimes people feel because there is no subject which is like relevant to me, so like that's why people tend less to go to theater. So we want a subject matter to like bring more East Asian in, but at the same time we think like our arts is definitely more not just speaking with the British East Asian, it's definitely speaking to the broader sector. So in a way that kind of like proportion I think is quite good, and this is what we try to achieve. It's like people, it's a broader range of the audiences, and anybody who is interested in hearing intriguing story and build and intriguing music, and then they are our audience. Yeah.
Definitely, I'm really envious of how easy you were able to kind of tell us the data of your audiences. I think speaking on behalf of Tangram Radio, and I hope you don't hate me for saying this, but that's something that we need to do better at. And I just think of all these kind of applications that artists have to write, and a classic question is like, who is your audience? Like, show us your data. And Raylan and I are always kind of scrambling a little bit, but I won't tell if you won't tell. That's to all 36 people in this room, of course. Lovely. And so we have a parenthesis from Becca. I think maybe just to speak to this point just a little bit, which is just to go back to those specific examples. I think this is a really nice kind of connection to what Hyelim was saying. Hyelim was saying earlier about the kind of intangible nature of music and art, and how these how pieces like Jasmine Kent Rodgman's 19 Ways of Looking, it's very much a commentary about experiences of real live people today, but in kind of showing them in the way that she does on Instagram, through music, through visuals, through narrative, that there is an intangible kind of addition to it that you don't, it's like, it's stupid for me to try and articulate with words, but I would just encourage you all to check out these pieces, and hopefully you'll get a very clear sense of what putting them through an artistic medium does for these conversations. David Say has a question, which is, An-Ting, as a curator, how do you balance quality control with the need to find new artists / develop new work?
Yeah, I think this is like always like a very difficult question, and I would say in a way I wouldn't avoid saying this is subjective in a way. So kind of like to have like quality control, and especially when we are talking about we present artists like in at the best quality like of the work. So it's just like it's very I mean it's I like arts just like about there is a subjective like line about kind of perspective in terms of what quality is. I think we kind of like need to agree in some way. But like what we do is like we try to see as many work as possible. So like I think there's lots of like time when you talk to like some wide organizations, they will say kind of, oh, there's not enough like Chinese artist productions, or like where are like people who are at mature like a stage. It's just like but we try really hard in terms of like going to see different works, and also we try to have open call at least like once a year for any work like to go, so then we can explore like different artists, because there's a tendency for organizations just carry on working with the same artists over and over again. But so we try to have open call in terms of like exploring new artists, and then also we try to, so in kind of like if like there is like some particular perspective from one production we work with, and which is like and there's a carry on plan, so kind of like we will find opportunity to continue the relationship as well. So like there are different ways of doing that, but Yeah, and so I mean these are kind of like our, and of course we also have like some questionnaires like to ask the audience, and what do you think about the work, and how many stars do you give. So we have like a objective, combine these like objective points and also subjective point in terms of like a quality control. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a it's such a pressing question, David. Thank you for that, and I think it's speaking to a slightly broader issue, which is like to what extent are organizations programming inverted brackets diverse artists for the sake of like kind of tokenistic gestures and that kind of thing. And I guess if I were to just add another comment, I think it's got to a point where, like, because you know art is so subjective, I think maybe one of the best, I think what I find to be one of the most convincing ways to ensure that balance between quality control, when you know, I think when people are on panels, they need to acknowledge the privileges that they have, whether like myself as a kind of a middle class Hong Kong British man, and so to some extent that means like not necessarily trusting my own instincts, which is a slightly strange mentality. But then I guess for that reason it's super important that we have panels of people to decide who receives commissions, who receives fundings, who come from a diverse set of backgrounds to make those decisions. And I know that Chinese arts now have a very also have a fantastic group of people who work together in that sense. A very specific question from Rachel Harris is going back to those audiences. Do you get Chinese students? Rachel, do you mean overseas Chinese students, or like Chinese, any, like the kind of broadest definition of that term, students from China? Do you get students from China An-Ting at Chinese Arts now?
I'm sorry, I still don't understand. So what do you mean students from China? Because I mean, we are not the educational like institution. So do you mean like artists or?
I think Rachel means, sorry, Rachel, go for it.
Yeah, just, you know, I mean, there are so many students who are from, you know, the People's Republic and studying in London now. I just wonder if they form part of your audience.
Yeah, okay, audience, yeah, definitely, kind of our students definitely are a part of our audience. And there are also like art students who kind of like submit proposal to us as well. So, and sometimes they form a part of like performers, like an artist as well. But it's also like, yeah, students, yeah, that's, they will be a part, they are a part of our student like audiences as well, yeah.
Cool. We have a couple of minutes remaining, so if you do have any more questions, do pop them in. An-Ting, I have a question for you, which is, what are your hopes for the kind of for the UK or London art space in the future? Like, what do you hope to see? What kind of changes do you envision?
Yes, I mean, kind of like I'm ambitious. So like in terms of like a real change, I think there will be a lot of like very successful productions led by like British East Asian artists, and then they make a real impression, a real impact about the cultural life in this country and into the world. And I see that's really like when people really can see different stories, and then when people are no longer feel surprised when hearing about, oh, British Chinese grow up in this country, and hearing about like Chinese instrument, and just feel appreciated about this instead of like just calling this as ethnic like kind of like music. And then so I see like when the productions become a very big impact, like and many productions, it's not just one Crazy Rich Asian, but lots of different productions are just like to show people very different perspectives about Chinese heritage people, artists in the world. Yeah,
definitely. A few more questions just for 1 minute. We'll see how far we get. But from Keith Howard, how are your funding streams holding up? And in particular, maybe this is the kind of part of the question that we can focus on, An-Ting. Are there new potentials for funding as events go online?
And so we are our funding like opportunity. I
understood the question to be more general, but perhaps not. Keith, would
you
like to?
funding.
expand?
No, I mean, we are just like, I'm like 50% of fundraiser, kind of like this is a part of my job, which is like just spend a lot of time on fundraising, kind of like, and our main funder is Arts Council, and we also just like and trying to get corporate sponsor, individual sponsor, and trust and foundations, and so all of the different people and to pitch with like different kind of productions, so like so just it's fundraising is a full topic, here.
Definitely. Lovely. We have reached 4:15. I can see that David Say has a question, but I think we're actually just gonna go on to the next kind of session, which is with David Say, which is wonderful. But An-Ting, thank you so much for your time, and as ever, so nice to chat to you and hear about your amazing plans for Chinese arts now in the next 12 months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. And welcome, David Say.
Hello.
Hi, David. Hello. Yes, so nice to have you. I mean, I guess to introduce David informally, so David is yet another one of these artists who do so much beyond, you know, what you might expect from a typical artist. David is a director, actor, has done a lot of kind of production in the past on behalf of two organizations that will come onto in a sec, a kind of curator within that, and someone who works across theatre, film, and lots of other genres. And I think David, amongst other artists, really have kind of trailblazed the art scene in the UK to make it more accessible and inclusive for people who look like us. And I think on behalf of Tangram, at least, David, we are hugely indebted to you for the space that we have now. And so within that, David was one of the founding members and the founding artistic director of Yellow Earth Theatre, who very recently rebranded as New Earth Theatre for their 25th anniversary. David was the artistic director there from 1995 to 2008. And David was also the creative director of Chinese Arts Space, which is the organization that has now evolved to Chinese Arts Now. So we're kind of almost going back in time from that conversation with An-Ting. But David was director from Causeway Chinese Arts Space from 2006 to 2017. But David, I welcome and thank you so much for being here. We've had a really engaging conversation so far. I mean, is there anything that you want to say immediately? I know you've been particularly lively on the chat box, but is there anything that you'd like to respond to in particular, firstly, before we explore more conversations?
I want to, well, first of all, thank both of you. Well, actually, all of you involved in Tangram, not both of you. There's a few of you. And so as for this opportunity to talk and also to hear An-Ting and the two wonderful artists you had before her. I suppose I've been doing what I've been doing for 30 odd years. And what I want to see is this kind of plurality of art forms and artists in music and all other art forms as well. And there's a kind of level playing field and openness to listen and to be curious about other people's lived experiences, the complexity of that, as we heard from Kiku and Hyelim, you know, the complexity, but also the kind of the experimentation that's going on, the beauty of it. And I suppose it's about trying to encourage everybody to be slightly more international in their outlook, slightly less insular, slightly less provincial. And as an island nation that voted majority Brexit, you know, we've got a cultural battle on our hands, folks, because I think everybody probably in this room is interested in more intercultural dialogue and perhaps are slightly on the more liberal progressive side of things. So I think that's the challenge facing all of us, whoever whoever we are, whatever art forms we engage in, is to kind of keep a dialogue going and get people to listen to each other. I think social media has really polarized people. It's led to a lot of factionalism, even in the arts, which always saddens me, and a lot of unnecessary politics sometimes. And I think actually the most important thing is the art itself, and in what way is the art form universal, and it's speaking to us right here, right now. It's not just a sort of I mean, even old traditional art forms, they have their beauty, they have their purity, but also, in what ways can traditional forms be made more accessible, or experimented with, or what sort of fusion or collaborations can produce new things. I think when it was, if you look at the history of Yellow Earth, which is now New Earth, the trajectory of that company went from people who were exploring traditional East Asian physical theatre, but integrating it with their Western drama school training and trying to use those physical forms in a new way, in an experimental way, that was similar in some ways, but different, similar to, in some ways, to the way Complicité trained Jacques Lecoq, and they all learned European new mime, but they developed a new physical language for theatre through experimenting. And that's very much what the early work of Yellow Earth was. And as it evolved, it continued to be interested in physical visual work, but also new writing became more of a priority. And so now I would say New Earth theatre is like any other new writing company in many ways, but it's focused on writers of East Asian heritage, East and Southeast Asian heritage. And the physical stuff is less to the fore, I would say, these days. And that's fine, companies evolve and artistic directors take companies in different directions. What's been great to see An-Ting also, when she took over CAS, is that she's found a lot of other newer artists, which is wonderful. She's doing her job now full time. When I was running it, it was just 1 day a week. So my ability to find as many different or newer artists as An-Ting was slightly more limited because I was only doing it 1 day a week. But it's fantastic to see the flowering of both New Earth and Can in terms of the diversity and the range, how broad that is. And I just think what Tangram is trying to do is a similar thing, but you're focused on music, and that's great. Just as CFCCA up in Manchester is trying to do the same for visual artists. I think arts is about a need for certain people to express what it means to be human, our lived experience, what is of importance to us, whether it's kind of our cultural identity or the cultural art forms we're interested in. I think that's why we are what we are and we do what we do. And what we want really is an audience. We want people to be curious and open and interested, to learn and listen, as we share what we're discovering ourselves. And, the big challenge, I suppose, for when I ran both Yellow Earth and also CAS was always trying to find new artists, new stories, new whatever forms of expression, but also to ensure that it was supported and developed sufficiently so that when it's shown to a public, when it's shared, it's branded very clearly if it's work in progress or, this is a workshop. But I think when you say this is work that's ready to show to the public, the quality needs to be so high that nobody can say that wasn't good enough.
And so in that sense, would you say that, are you suggesting, or would you say that there is a pressure on East Asian or people of color to make their output to a higher standard than maybe that of their white peers?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've seen a lot of white-led made work that's very variable. You've got excellent, fantastic work, good quality, average, and also, they didn't quite work. But because there's such a variety of it, people don't therefore dismiss white work. I mean, they don't even call it white work, they just call it work, right? It's just this unfortunate thing, the way diversity and the language of diversity is used in the UK, is that we're put into this box. And so it is harder because it's not our work, it's not happening all the time. So white-led work is happening all the time. So sometimes you like it, sometimes you don't, but you then don't dismiss it. You don't dismiss the entire culture because you saw one bad piece. Whereas unfortunately, the pressure we're under, because there aren't enough either revenue funded or, there's only in the whole of the UK, in terms of performing arts, there is New Earth Theatre and there is Chinese Arts Now. And all the other companies are all project funded. So, and you just said how difficult it is for project funded companies to be able to say, oh, our audience makeup is X, Y, Z, because you haven't got the resources to gather all the audience data, to become that's kind of, I mean, when I started Yellow Earth, for example, at the beginning, we were also struggling, and you have to kind of do all your audience questionnaires, you have to do the data, you have to play that game with the arts to apply for revenue funding. You've got that information to hand. Even for your next project funding thing, that's the information you require. So you've got to gather. You've got to be able to play the game. But I do feel, unfortunately, because of the rarity of East Asian-led work in the UK, that when you do see one bad thing, it does slightly impact on the whole sector's reputation. And then I think that's probably why it's led to kind of some of the rather toxic politics that goes on between certain East Asian artists. It's entirely unnecessary because we're so small as a sector. We should be kind of encouraging and supporting each other, and work is where it is. Artists are where they're at. Some are more experienced than others, and you take the work as it comes, right? In the same way that you should with white artists or any artist, at their stage of. But there is a hell of a lot more pressure for BAME artists, that when you're given that window, that opportunity, it's got to be at such a level that nobody can criticize it. And when it does, when it gets a 1-star review, for example, it feels shameful. Do you know what I mean?
I do, and I think that's a really,
feels, wasted an opportunity. Just feels like something in the process that hasn't gone right in the process. I mean, most of our work will probably get at least 3 or 4-star, but occasionally you do get work that gets 1 star, and you just think, gosh, that was embarrassing. But it's nothing to do with me, it's nothing to do with us or you or I, but somehow what one feels that when that happens, it reflects on all of us, because the people who might then be curious to see the next East Asian something might be put off by what they've read.
Yeah, and I totally hear what you're saying. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge here that that's not getting a 1-star review is not necessarily the failure of the artist, but as much a comment about the industry as anything else. You know, it says a lot about the reviewer's tastes. It says a lot about our space's tastes as well. And so, obviously,
Absolutely.
just bearing in mind these different things is super important.
Absolutely.
But that's so
absolutely
really helpful to hear, David. And so yeah, such a rich kind of response there. And I guess 2 things to tease out immediately. I think firstly, that kind of assumed centrality of whiteness that we have across the arts is so prevalent. And you know, particularly speaking from my own experiences from music, you know, like I studied what is termed as music at university in the UK. And what they really mean by music is Western art music. It's classical music written by the likes of Bach, Beethoven, Brahms. That's what they mean. I think about 95% of my course was music by these dead white men, and 5% was either about female composers of color, or other genres, all packed into just kind of 5% of a 3-year degree.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of need to decenter our assumption that the pillars of art are white is really important.
Absolutely.
And I think the second thing is the point that you were saying about funding, which I think is a really good thing to raise, I think, in this kind of conversation about curation and the kind of gatekeepers, if you like, of our industries. But the way in which art isn't really possible without funding. We can't make livings without money, and that's the kind of reality of a capitalist society. And so being able to tick those boxes in funding applications is arguably more important than creating the art itself. And I'm really glad, Dave, that you've raised kind of how important that issue is, and how isolated these are, like funding and creating art. I think it's very easy to romanticize the livelihood or the work or day-to-day work, I guess, of an artist, where like, oh, just write your music, and if you create great art, it will be great. And obviously the idea of greatness in itself, you know, is definitely worth considering through a kind of colonial lens, if you like. And I guess a kind of follow-up question to all of that, David, and particularly as someone who has been in the industry for as long as you have, and someone who has seen as much as you have, are you hopeful today, in this moment now, of a better space? Have you seen a positive change, and are you optimistic for the future?
Definitely. I think obviously this year has been disastrous for the arts, and it's been particularly bad for the East and Southeast Asian sector in terms of racism. We've never had such global levels of racist hate crimes, hate speech. It's one reason I'm involved in CARG, which is COVID-19 Anti-Racism Group. It's a group of community activists who've come together to speak up and push back against media disinformation, misinformation, as well as politicians and the kind of the likes of not just Donald Trump, but in this country, Michael Gove, Ian Duncan Smith, sadly all Tories, Tom Tugendhat. You know, they've kind of said a lot of anti-China things which are quite xenophobic. And that's all added fuel to the kind of 900% increase in hate speech online against people who are Chinese or from China, the country connected to the country of China. But it's also led to, because people are mistaken on the streets, they can't tell the difference between Koreans or Japanese or Eurasians and Chinese, and so we're all collectively attacked. And so I just feel that at the moment, arts plays such an important role to communicate our humanity, to challenge some of these stereotypes that we've talked about before. Every art form, I think, every artist has an incredibly important role to play to push back against some of that. And so while the environment feels negative, feels, you know, difficult, I also think that the pandemic has forced everybody, because even all the white-led gatekeepers, all the white-led venues and people who are gatekeepers, cultural gatekeepers, they've had to look at their own survival. They've had to seek support from the BAME community in order to justify applying for more funding or whatever, because the Arts Council has a you know, one of their policies is about diversity and inclusion. So, you know, certain white-led venues, theatre venues, that I've done a show in, I did a show in years ago. They've had no contact since, because it was an East Asian show, so therefore I worked there, no further contact. But then all of a sudden, they've been in touch and said, would I support their campaign, blah, 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 you know, and it's, everybody is looking for support from others. So actually this is a great time for everybody to say, I'm happy to have a conversation, but let's have a more, I suppose, a fuller conversation rather than just a tokenistic one. You need our help because you want to tick that diversity box, but actually let's have a proper conversation about what is diversity, what is inclusion. And it's not just the odd East Asian project or the odd East Asian artist that you might just bring in and you tick that box, but it's actually looking at your team. You know, look at the staff who work there on a day-to-day basis. How diverse is that? How inclusive is it? And we've seen that in the art form that I'm mostly working in, theatre, for example, you know, the main casting thing is still majority white, and then it's the token black, or it's white and the token South Asian, or it's, you know, white and then the token disabled person. Or
it's kind of one in, one out policy.
Yes, exactly. It's that kind of, it feels quite tokenistic. I've seen so many productions like that. And you kind of think, you know, or it's, you know, white and then one black, one South Asian, and then they've done their job. And you kind of think, actually, it's a completely different mindset. It's about when you cast, just cast as diverse as possible. Just cast in a way that reflects the UK as it is today. And as long as they can do their job, then consider them. Don't just think of East and Southeast Asian people only when you do an East or Southeast Asian project, you know, because we're British at the end of the day. You know, I mean, most of my acting work on radio, for example, I don't use this voice, which is a British voice. I have to put on an East Asian accent. And that is 99.9% of the work I get on radio. And I've done a lot of radio over the years of my 30 odd years, but it's, you know, that's, and you kind of think, well, then we're not considered British actors. We're only considered as East and Southeast Asian actors. And then, you know, what's galling is that when something like BBC Radio 4 does a long series, such as the Inspector Chen series, they had a few, they had, say in a cast of 20, 5 of the leads might be East Asian, but the other 15 will be from the BBC radio drama team, and they're all white. Or,
and I think that,
so,
sorry.
You know, so that's the kind of thing that we're still having to deal with.
For sure. And
enforced invisibility.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that leads really nicely into our questions. And so just to open this up, I can see that a few questions have come in already, David, but I think that's a really nice segue into a question from Naomi Wu, which is, as producers / curators, what responsibility do we have to shift this responsibility? Are there ways we can be making space for artists of color to present work in lower risk contexts? And so I think this is speaking to the discussion we were having about, having a one-star review and what that says about maybe less so on the artist, but more on the space and the reviewer, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But how do you respond to that?
Well, I think there are so many different venues. So I think as producers, curators, if it's a very new artist and very young work and very raw, then you would hopefully present them in a safer space. You wouldn't put an emerging artist it's their very first production. You'd put it on at the Vaults, for example, which is a sort of more fringe venue, rather than at the Barbican or the RS. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's how you protect artists. You match where they're at, the experience they've got, and also the quality of what they and at the same time you don't have a one size fits all, because some new artists, their quality is so good, you want to get them in the big mainstream venues as quickly as possible. So you have to manage things safely. I remember very early on in the company of Yellow Earth, it was founded by 5 of us, somebody who hadn't trained as a theatre director wanted to direct the company's show, and we were only funded to do one show a year. So my response was, we can certainly present a workshop, of the work that you want to do and so on, work in progress, but I can't really hand over the one time that we're on show to the press and so on, because if that one show a year isn't at least 3 or 4 star, the company's reputation and the ability to carry on surviving and getting funding for the future might not exist. So I was very, on the one hand, I absolutely want to support the development of my colleague and peer, but at the same time, you've got to kind of be able to walk before you can run. And so you can't just automatically assume that without any training whatsoever as a director, you can automatically do it. You've got to, do slightly smaller scale things first, build up your experience before you're ready to do the main show, one show a year, to show to all the critics and so on, because the survival of the company depends on that. So I just think, that's what you need to do as a producer, as a curator, is kind of manage things so that people aren't exposed in an unnecessarily harsh way. Because when critics who go to watch stuff, they expect a certain standard. Okay, when you watch fringe shows, you understand how fringe shows are made, the limited resources they have, so you judge things according to that. When you watch a mainstream show in a mainstream venue, again, you bring that kind of judgment, I guess. So horses for courses. Absolutely invest in new talent, showcase opportunity, but also artists and curators, don't be overly arrogant about what the piece is. Just saying, oh, because I'm culturally different and I've got my identity to show the world, and therefore you must listen and it's great work. I mean, no artist should ever think like that. And sadly, the PC nature of social media sometimes makes people think they can run before they can walk.
And just to
Yeah,
I think just to kind of respond to that, I think Naomi has a few kind of follow-up things which I think would be really interesting to discuss as well. And so I can hear that you're saying something along the lines of you know, if we have people who are of a certain standard, which I'll put in inverted brackets for now, you know, they should have a corresponding space and a corresponding audience.
Yeah.
And so Naomi has a question to this, which is, should Asian artists not be allowed to make bad or mediocre work and everything in between? And a follow-up, which is that by expecting everything to only be of, inverted brackets, the highest quality according to Western standards, are we not perpetuating the idea that artists of color must achieve a standard of perfection that is not asked of white artists rather than dismantling it?
No. So basically, we're all entitled to make good, average, or bad work. You know, we're all entitled. That's part of the nature of being an artist. Sometimes, even the most experienced artists, sometimes a process goes well and something works. Other times it doesn't, and it's not as good. So we're absolutely entitled. What I'm saying is, it's about how it's received, and I don't think you should say, you know, the white standard or Eurocentric standard. Actually, you know, the standard of the East Asian artists, the quality of the musicianship and so on, we heard last night is, you know, it's a global standard. That's a concert hall standard. So the quality of artists that we're talking about is extremely high here. And, you know, if people don't know how to appreciate it, that is a different question. Because, you know, a lot of people, if you've grown up listening to Western classical music, you will be able to appreciate that. If you've never heard the shakuhachi or the, forgive me, I don't know the name of the instrument that Hyelim plays. What's it called? Tangram, the Tangram. You see, even that, right? I read it, but I don't know how to pronounce it because I've never heard it before. Okay, I've heard the violin, I've heard the piano. Tangram, you know, it's not common parlance. So, you know, if you're not used to listening to something like that, then how can, as a classical critic, for example, how would they have the understanding or the ability to critique it? So, you know, a lot of what we're doing, especially if we're exploring traditional art forms, a lot of that is also about education, exposing people to the work, you know, making it accessible and educating them. But, you know, by all means, I mean, I certainly don't think we should feel under more pressure than anybody else, you know. But I think as curators, we do have a responsibility to put people into safe spaces, so that, you know, because critics are harsh, and you just don't want the development of an artist to be falsely arrested, or, you know, because somebody has laid into them. And that includes fellow East Asian, you know, the ones that I'm talking about who are quite toxic and attack other people who do an art form that they themselves either don't understand or are not interested in. You know, they want to limit and restrict the diversity of, or the possibilities of exploring, you know, your cultural heritage. So, you know, I think contemporary work is great, fusion work is great, but those who want to explore traditional work, fantastic too. There's a place, and there should be a space for everybody. You know, there is a minority of very militant people who keep dismissing all that as exotic. And I just think actually it's up to, everybody has their own journey of being who and what they want to be as an artist, and they should be free to do so. And I think this accusation of exoticism is actually an incredibly racist and colonial and Eurocentric one. But sadly, it's people who have who are from our own cultural background, but they've internalized racism so much that in some ways, without realizing it, they want to be white. And I certainly don't want to be that. I want us to be able to have the freedom to choose whatever is part of the complex makeup of who and what we are. As we heard with Kiku, you know, she's Eurasian, brought up in Denmark, and I think all that should be separated, you know, and inevitably her exploration perhaps of because of who and what she is going to be slightly different. It might not be, you know, just as she's experimenting and improvising with the shakuhachi, maybe somebody who's born in Japan and so on, you know, might equally, you know, be exploring just exactly the same experimentation, you know, but the likelihood is, because of subtle cultural differences between different cultures, that maybe, you know, Hyelim and Kiku are doing something slightly different, slightly more innovative. Certainly when the early work of Yellow Earth, when we were experimenting with Beijing opera movement, for example, I hadn't yet seen that. I'd seen a lot of Beijing opera in traditional forms, but I hadn't seen that much experimentation.
David, I'm really sorry. I'm actually going to have to interrupt you just because unfortunately we've run out of time. I can see that we've had a really lively chat box in the last 5 minutes talking about this issue of like essentially like what quality are we judging against, and whether that the kind of bar that we have isn't an inherently white one. And I think just to refer to Kiku's,
I would say we have to set the bar ourselves.
And I can see that Kiku has written that.
Set that ourselves, and then also we as curators, producers, we also set that bar.
I hear you. Thank you very much.
We certainly don't follow a white one. We just, you know, but you have to be aware of what the mainstream white one is, you know.
Absolutely.
You're aware of it, but, you know, we set our own bar.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Okay. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end this session there, but thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone who has been listening in and kind of contributing to this chat box. I'm just going to pass it on to Raylan now to wrap up before our very exciting finale. But thank you very much, David, and Raylan, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, David, and to Hyelim and Kiku and An-Ting. This conversation is so energetic, it's cooking. There's so much here for us to talk about, and Zoom, of course, is inadequate for us to have this conversation fully. But one word that, David, you used, I really want to highlight is flowering. Like I see this gathering as really just a beginning of a wider conversation, a chance for us to see who else is in this space, who's thinking about these questions, and for us to continue to connect and converse, and for that to be a proliferation of ideas and conversations. So we have an amazing premiere coming up of a special commission from Naomi Wu from Tangram and Young Suk Choi from Asia Arts Activism. This is a piece we were fortunate enough to commission specifically for this symposium, so this will be our finale. I'm going to just post the watch link in the chat now for anyone who is on a laptop or desktop. You can go ahead and queue that up in your browser. It's going to be a YouTube premiere. If you're on mobile, you might want to wait until the end to click out. This link is also in the Eventbrite page, so there's different ways you can land on that watch page. It's going to premiere at 5 p.m. and go till 5:10. So huge thank you to everyone for sticking with us for this Zoom symposium. I know there's, Zoom fatigue is real, so we tried to keep this as succinct as possible, and we really hope you can just stay on until 5:10 to experience this wonderful piece. In the meantime, before I introduce that piece, I want to highlight 2 ways for us to keep this flowering, this conversation going. originally, you know, this was envisioned as an in-person symposium with performances and discussion. Of course, that is the ideal form for all of this, and we hope to create an event like that in the future. But in the meantime, our means are virtual. And so the first way for us to stay connected is to use social media and to use this hashtag new creativities and tagging at Tangram Sound, not only as a way to make your questions and your voice heard, but also by clicking on this hashtag, whether that's on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, you'll be able to see all of the other responses to the symposium and see who else has been watching, and you can follow up by following them or connecting them. So that is one way for us to stay connected. I would love to invite everyone who is comfortable using social media just to post any sort of reaction, a question or a comment to the symposium on whichever platform you're comfortable with, just so we can have eyes on who is in this gathering today and keep this conversation going. For those who do not use social media, we have a second way to connect, which is we're going to follow up with an email for a kind of connection directory. We're going to invite anyone who's here, who's part of this, to submit your contact information and a couple of lines of what you do. We're going to create a directory to share with everyone in that group, so that we have that, you know, more old school way to stay in touch. And finally, we have some podcast episodes coming out too. So other content in this vein that will be able to, yeah, basically keep this conversation going. So this piece that is coming up is called How to Repair a Broken Vase. It's a new work by Young-Suk Choi and Naomi Wu exploring East Asian femininity, drawing on the story of Afong Moy, the first East Asian woman in the United States, and Mosuo mythology. The video observes the close relationship between East Asian bodies and Oriental ornaments. In an imaginative revisiting of the story of Afong Moy, we shatter this unbearable cage of the Western gaze and gently, carefully recover an alternative for Afong Moy and for ourselves. I encourage you as well to check out the YouTube description to see the bios of these two incredible artists that we're going to see some work from. And the final prompt, as a way to kind of kick off this finale, is an instruction from our artists for how to view this performance. The instruction is this: look around you, find the object nearby that would best be described as Asian. If you can, take it in your hands and hold it close while watching the piece. If the object cannot be held, maintain it in view. So we are wrapping this up right now really quickly, very energetically. We hope to stay in contact with as many of you as possible. I'm now going to give you 2 minutes to find your object and click out to the watch page. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And we hope you have a great weekend.